You're listening to The Moth of Glen Mailey. Orla jerked her body out of the clod of hawthorn, getting caught on every blasted branch. The dry, sharp branches scratched at her cheeks and her neck, leaving long, ragged scratches all over. She backed away from the gap in the bushes, seeing the eyes follow her upward through the small gaps in the trees. No, fuck no, I am seeing shit. She backed up, careful not to turn her back on whatever was out there in the tree line. She watched the bushes at the base of the tree line for any signs of Anya. Anya, if you don't get your ass out here, I'm leaving you out in the woods. She backed up, quick in her feet, trying not to trip on the mud. Her flashlight bounced over the empty field as she began to put distance between herself and the woods, her whole body suddenly freezing cold in the rain. Orla made quick work of the porch steps and took them two at a time, the whole time feeling as though she was leaving her back exposed to whatever was out there. Every baby hair on the back of her neck was standing on edge. It's nothing, she kept telling herself, trying to regain her backwoods sensibilities. This was part of being out in the great outdoors. She shared the woods out here with a lot of creatures besides herself, and it wasn't like she was alone out here. This was just another aspect of being in nature, same as the dirt and the bugs and the rotting firewood. She felt the forest wisdom start to calm her nerves as her wet, fumbling hands opened the sliding door. She was out in nature and part of nature, Shannon would always say, and everything that lived out here in these woods was technically her neighbor. Just as she began to slide the door shut, she heard a trill and saw the wet, ancient, matted body of Anya appear at the crack in the door. The cat looked at her sourly, like she had ruined her late night out. "Get inside, young lady," Orla growled through her grit teeth. Begrudgingly, the cat slid through the crack in the door, and then Orla closed it in earnest, making sure that it and the rest of the doors and the windows in the cabin were locked. As she did, her eyes took one last sweep outside, onto the dark land behind the porch and the forest beyond. The bobbing shadows of the trees being blown around in the dark made her tired mind confused. When it was dark and you were already paranoid, every shifting branch looked like a form lurking just beyond the property line. Orla shut her eyes, shaking her head. The stress of travel had finally caught up to her, she sighed, and she was due for a hard reset with some good sleep. She flipped the circuit breaker back on and checked the doors once again for good measure, and then finally pulled herself back into bed. A silent prayer lifted out of her thoughts, addressed to whoever was listening out there. She was by herself out in these woods this time around, and hopefully this was the only night she'd be seeing things, because she wasn't sure she had much strength for any more of it. She slid into a broken sleep and woke the next day to a thick veil of luxurious fog rolling through the trees the next morning. Bleary-eyed but somewhat cheered by the weather, Orla dragged herself out of bed to give Anya an early breakfast and began to brew coffee grounds on the stove. Shannon didn't keep a coffee maker and preferred a percolator, but there was something that Orla had always really liked about that. The pot, no matter how much you cleaned it, took on a pleasant season and always made the most robust, strong sort of coffee. Orla swore that it didn't matter what sort of grounds you put inside, it was the magic of the old percolator itself that made such good coffee. During some of her worst back-to-back shifts that rolled into exams during college, she dreamt about this very cup of coffee, a small, soft glow of nostalgia beginning to warm her chest as she stood in the kitchen in her oversized t-shirt, feet barefoot on the chilly floor. Coffee smell began to bubble out of the yellowed Corningware percolator, letting her know it was time to switch off the flame. She pulled a chip mug out of the cabinet and poured herself a cup of black coffee, simply leaving it as is in the mug. In the back-facing kitchen window, she could see the familiar blue haze of fog and the spectacular Smokies, dipped a deep shade of purple-blue in the early morning light. It was a sight almost breathtaking enough to make her forget about last night. Orla blew in her coffee and steeled herself as she neared the backsliding door once more, unlocking the latch. Anya rubbed against her ankles, waiting at the back door to be let out. Orla looked askance at the cat, not trusting her judgment after their debacle in the rain last night. She still had no idea how that window had opened so high up in the bathroom, and she shuddered, not wanting to put too much thought into the details. The back door slid open, and Orla watched Anya bound outside. She was about to yell at the old cat until she realized that she, too, was keeping to the perimeter of the porch itself and didn't seem to want to go near the stairs. The property beyond, however, was quiet, sleepy in the cotton blue haze of the morning fog, lifting off the rain-sodden mountain. Outside, the air smelled like earth and pine, chilled and fresh with the moist scent, like the world had been wiped clean. She stepped out into the porch, feeling something snap under her borrowed pair of boots. Orla jumped, almost spilling her coffee, the sound of twigs snapping making her anxious after last night. She reminded herself that the storm had likely washed a bunch of debris that needed to be swept off the deck. She lifted her foot and looked underneath, surprised indeed to see a twig, but wrapped around it seemed to be what looked like a wet, unraveling bow. Her eyebrows wrinkled her forehead as she crouched down to study the twig. She'd seen debris and trash wash up in a storm before, but nothing so precious as a ribbon that had somehow tied itself around the branch in the wind. She smiled to herself and picked it up, placing it on one of the posts of the deck, like a decoration. Maybe something pretty would bring her luck, especially since it seemed like some sort of karmic apology from the forest itself in some ways. She looked down at the tattered blue ribbon, and her smile faltered for a moment, wondering where it had come from, since not a soul lived around Shannon for miles in all directions. The supermarket was surprisingly empty, Orla noted, as she waited for her items to be scanned by the tired older cashier at the register. The cashier packed away her groceries as Orla's eyes wandered out through the front window of the supermarket to the tow truck sitting out front. A muddy electric car sat chained on the back bed of the tow truck, looking out of place and somewhat comical all the way out here in Glen Mailey. Orla smirked, nodding her chin out to the car. "What's up with that thing?" she asked. "Oh, that," the cashier said with a touch of annoyance in their voice. "Guy drove across state with his family and thought they would be charging stations along the way out here." "Does he not know how to use a phone?" Orla laughed. "If I'm being honest, he doesn't even know how to use that car, miss," the cashier said, gesturing towards the frazzled man on the phone towards the entrance. "He's been on the phone with his insurance for over an hour out there." "Well, I'll pray for him," Orla replied, and her and the cashier shared an ironic smile. He handed her the bag, and she made her way out of the store, past the man arguing on his Bluetooth headset. "Look, I understand that, but I'm telling you, I'm in the middle of bumfuck nowhere in Tennessee, on vacation. I need you to fix this for me right now." Orla grimaced as she exited the sliding doors of the supermarket. He definitely didn't sound like a gracious sort of person. In some ways, she thought to herself, she was glad to see the local towing company making money off of him, instead of imposing on a friendly town local. In the front row of the parking spots by the supermarket entrance, she spotted his two children sitting on the curb arguing with one another, and what looked like his young wife standing motionless next to them. Her sharp, mousy features looked severe in that clean, fashionable sort of way that quietly wealthy women tended to be, aging gracefully in their athleisure and cashmere, faces only softly touched by age. She made eye contact with the woman as she exited the store and nodded to her. "Morning." The woman regarded her with confusion, saying nothing in response to her greeting. Orla rolled her eyes and walked back to Shannon's truck. She hadn't even brought her own car into town, given all the mud in the precarious state of the town's roads. She had no idea what the waylaid family planned to do once they charged the blasted car. There were few places to drive something that low to the ground after a storm like this. She shrugged, tossing her bag of groceries on the floor of the passenger seat. None of that was her problem, and she had plenty of her own business to mind anyways. She started up the truck and headed back to the cabin, taking it slow through the mountain roads. As she neared the cabin, however, she neared a sheriff checkpoint at the small, overgrown intersection. She pulled up to the sheriff and rolled down her window. "Hey, officer." Brendan turned around as she called to him, a small smile crossing his face as he spotted her in the driver's seat of the old truck. "I thought I'd recognize this old car. When'd you get back into town?" "Last night. Quite the weather out here, huh?" She smiled, leaning out the window. "You sure picked a hell of a week to visit, I'll tell you that. We just closed down Ashwood because the streetlights are down, detouring everyone through Millburn right now." "Shit," she whistled with disappointment. "I know." He shook his head, his blue eyes looking tired. "Thankfully, it's not a big town. Detour on Millburn should only take an extra 6 minutes. "Yeah," Orla said trepidatiously, her voice laden with unspoken thoughts. She hated going down Millburn. She avoided it at all costs when she did visit. "Hey, everything all right with your face? Also, I was thinking you should probably come down to dinner sometime soon this week. I know Nina'd be happy to see you." "I will, I promise," Orla nodded with an easy smile, planning in her mind to do no such thing. She didn't exactly love the idea of crashing dinner randomly at her ex's house with his pregnant wife cooking. She rolled up her window before Brendan could ask any more questions and pulled off towards the detour. Everyone liked to mind everyone else's business out here, she reminded herself. The narrow road of Millburn was densely wooded on both sides and sparsely dotted with houses along the roadside. She'd driven it so many times in the past that she could practically take every sloping curve blind. When she was a teen, Orla reminisced, she'd gunned her crappy sedan down this road in the early mornings to pick up her friend, who lived at the very edge of the street before it split off onto another block. They'd pile into the car and careen down the hill down to the gas station for coffee, and then roll into school with minutes to spare before the first bell. It was their ritual. Her and Mona used to have a lot of rituals, as enmeshed teenage girls tended to be, before the same curves of Millburn took Mona one night in a drunk driving accident a year and a half after high school. A dreadful aching pain entered her chest as the truck neared Mona's little shrine, now just a tattered set of small stuffed animals and tinsel wrapped around a tree as a memorial. Years of wind, snow, and rain had diminished the meaning of the small set of offerings, and that made her especially sad as she neared the memorial and stopped the car. She hopped out of the truck with her bag of groceries and strode over to the shrine in Shannon's borrowed boots, looking down at the sun-bleached bellies of stuffed dogs next to a laminated photo of Mona from her high school yearbook. Mona stared back at her from the faded placard, and Orla stared back for a very long time, rememorizing the soft swell of Mona's high cheeks, soft brown eyes, and thick wavy hair. It had been a while, maybe too long, Orla decided, frowning back at Mona's smiling photo. She fished out an orange from her plastic bag and placed it at the foot of the tree, underneath Mona's photo. Good to see you, Em. Thanks for listening. The miniseries returns with Part 2 on October 5th, and then again on October 10th with Part 3. Can't wait to see you there, and whatever you do, don't cross the river into the woods.